Don't know me, I'm Anna Luker, one of the pediatric hospitalists at Kapiolani, and I co-direct Pediatric Echo. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Morgan here, who's going to be speaking about child welfare services, ultimately top things for us to know as pediatricians when calling in cases, and going over some Q&A during our last talk in this field. There had been quite a few who had voiced interest in the session, so I'm very excited. I will let Dr. Morgan take it from here.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending today. As you see with the topic, child welfare service referrals, the top 5 things a pediatrician needs to know. I just want to start out by saying this is really for any pediatric healthcare provider and any healthcare professional in general. And I'm really hoping that you leave today's presentation with some additional nuggets. And I will have my contact information at the end so that if there are things that are unclear or you have questions along the way, I'm happy to help. If there are questions during the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat. And with that, I will move along. Okay. All right. So first, again, just wanted to say aloha. I recently celebrated my 1-year anniversary being here, being in Hawaii, and being at Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children. And I've learned a lot. I still have lots to learn. But overall, it's been a really great year. And then I did want to take the time at the top of the presentation to say mahalo to all of you for attending, taking time out of your lunch and your very busy day. And thank you to Drs. Luker and Maxim for inviting me to present on this topic. And a most gracious mahalo nui loa to Summer for her patience and her help in all the logistics that go around with ECHO and having to do presentations. So as mentioned, these are the learning objectives. My hope is that at the end of this presentation, you will be able to recognize the role of mandated reporters. CWS, or Child Welfare Services, can sort of be this big box of what is it, what does it mean? And so again, hopefully you'll be able to better describe and define the role and responsibilities of CWS. You'll have a better understanding and be able to discuss the essential components that are needed in making CWS referrals. And then I thought an interesting way to present this would be sort of my list of the top 5 things that are really essential for you to know in understanding more about CWS and the referral process. So I would not be able to start any presentation about child maltreatment without first going over and reviewing our statute. So the Hawaii Revised Statute 350-1 gives us the legal threshold and the legal definition of child abuse and neglect. And so I'm going to give you a moment to read through that and then just expand a little bit on the highlighted portion. So as you read through this statute, you'll see that I highlighted to be harmed or to be subject to any reasonably foreseeable substantial risk of being harmed. And so that's really our threshold. And so you'll probably hear me mention that a few more times throughout the presentation. So definitely wanted to make sure that you understood the threshold for us and the threshold for CWS in terms of their involvement. So the key word is harm. And you'll hear me talk about actual harm versus risk of harm versus imminent harm, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But when we look at the statute and we look at actual harm, these are the things that are listed there. And so really that term injury refers to a number of things: burns, substantial bleeding, fractures, those sorts of injuries, failure to thrive, poisoning. Then we have sexual contact or sexual misconduct, psychological harm, child being provided harmful drugs or delay in medical care. And then sadly, there are instances where some harm does lead to death. So let's move through the top 5 things that I think are really important for healthcare professionals, pediatricians to know as it relates to CWS and referrals. So the first thing on my list, and I think ultimately why we're all in this field, the field of medicine specifically as it relates to children, is that we understand that really, as cliche as it sounds, children are our future. And so the goal of CWS is really to ensure the protection of children. that children deserve to be raised and to live in a home that's safe and competent, and we'd add in things like happy and supportive, all of those things. And that if children are not properly parented or not in those type of environments, they do not and may not meet their full potential. So the purpose of CWS is really to protect children. It's to determine if harm has occurred, and that's a civil responsibility. And I will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Once CWS gets involved, based on the threshold of their involvement, they are to protect a child from further harm, and they're to minimize the effects of whatever harm has occurred. Other roles of CWS would be to preserve the family and address that family's needs. And how they do that is that once the intake process begins and they investigate and assess that family, they're able to do a home safety assessment. They're able to see how we can strengthen the family, because really the goal and the purpose of involvement is to build on that family and to try to have a healthy family that can stay together if that child will be safe. During the course of their investigation, they may identify other victims. And then lastly, they do play a role while partnering with law enforcement and the court system to ensure the safety of children moving forward by ensuring consequences of the offender. So that may be ensuring that the child and the perpetrator are no longer in the same home, recommending treatment or parenting for possible offenders. Those are some of the things that they can also do that's part of their purview. So looking again at what child welfare services can do in terms of their responsibilities. Through diversion, they can provide outreach, assessments of the family. We know them more commonly to provide investigations, but there are other responses and services that they can put in place. There's a different unit here in the state as it relates to human trafficking. And then based on these things and their involvement, they're able to determine if that family is in need of services and make referrals for childcare, substance abuse, legal assistance, parenting classes, mental health, domestic violence assessments, anger management, and other emergency resources. So you pick up the phone, you make a call, you're making that report, and you'll hear me use the term report and referral interchangeably. When you make that call, the first thing that will happen is there should be an intake, and all those intake processes are logged. The next thing that would happen in that process, and this is a high-level overview, the next thing that would happen in that process would be an investigation if they have found that the referral meets the threshold for that criteria. And again, I'll go over that in detail in just a moment. Depending on the outcome of the investigation, if it is determined indeed that that child is not safe in the home, then that may require out-of-home placement. When that child is in out-of-home placement, there are still services that are being provided to the parents for that child. And the CWS also does have very strict deadlines as it relates to court to make sure that they can keep a child within their care. And then lastly, there's permanency planning. Ultimately, again, we want kids to be protected. We want them to be safe. We want them to be in loving and supportive homes. And sometimes that's the biological home, and sometimes it's not. But concurrently, as they're going through the investigation and services, they're thinking all the while about permanency planning and what's the safest environment for that child. So that could be family reunification, that could be TPR or termination of parental rights, with the child then being open for adoption into another family. Other services based on assessments and investigations by child welfare services, they may offer home-based comprehensive counseling service. There's a very family-centered approach to resolving matters of concern when it comes to child welfare and child protection, and that's called Ohana conferencing. And that's done with many of the cases where they get the family around the table, professionals around the table, and they really talk about what's in the best interest of that child. They're also responsible for the related costs if a child is placed in an out-of-home placement. And then CWS does have many, many service linkage agreements. I mentioned the referrals process that they have in terms of DV assessments, anger management, therapy, all of those things. They have service linkage agreements with many agencies within our community to make sure, again, that that child and that family are getting the services that they need. So no talk is complete without a few statistics. So here are a few for you to look at. In 2020, you will see that in our state, there were a little over 2,700 reports to Child Welfare Services. So that's that line where all the calls that came in, that's that number. And then you'll see it broken down into confirmed and not confirmed. Confirmed just really means that they were able to meet the threshold to say that some form of child maltreatment occurred. Not confirmed, they did not have enough to meet that evidence. And if you look at the bottom column of children where it says unique count, those 2,719 reports that came in 2020 also meant that there were close to 5,000 children that were involved in some sort of investigation or assessment with our Child Welfare Service department. Looking specifically in 2020 again at the types of reports of child maltreatment that occurred, you'll see that overwhelming majority of the reports were actually threatened harm. So with threatened harm, there may not be any risk of, there may not be any actual injury. It's more about the risk of that harm. The second most common type of maltreatment was neglect. And you'll see here in our state, we actually break out medical neglect, which I like. Neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment. And then secondly, you have physical abuse. And so in our state, you see that physical abuse is actually third on the list in terms of most common type of maltreatment. And then it's broken here down by the counties where it was reported. And then the bottom graph shows us based on the type, how many were actually confirmed or where they were able to say, yes, in fact, child maltreatment had occurred. Looking again at our state, about 90% of child maltreatment offenders in 2020 were found to be the parents. And looking at the pie chart here, you'll see again the numbers that other is really those cases of threatened harm or risk of harm. And I think it's just a nice reminder to show us that that's our threshold, is that threat of harm or that risk of harm is our threshold. So let's move on to number 2. This is just a gentle reminder because I know we all know this, that we are mandated reporters. This is a list of other mandated reporters in the state. And in some states, the state I moved from, North Carolina, everyone in the state was a mandated reporter. Here, any person can report, but by law, this is the list of individuals and professionals who are mandated reporters. So we are required by law, and that is something that I oftentimes will tell parents and families, is that this is my job to keep your child safe, to make sure your child is healthy, and it's my job because I'm required by law to make a report of child abuse and neglect when there's any concern. Not to scare anyone, but there is a penalty if you fail to report. Not trying to scare you, but just that you are aware that it is considered a petty misdemeanor. I will tell you, I came from a state where a physician did not report and was found guilty of the misdemeanor, and then also had to have additional child abuse education, which they contacted me to do the education. Was a little awkward, but just again to remind you, the ultimate penalty, I guess, would be that we don't identify and make sure a child is safe, but it is, you can be fined up to $1,000 and or up to 30 days in jail. I don't know that they've ever done that here in the state. I think my wonderful, wonderful colleague, Dr. Natarajan, is on, and I may at the end, not to put you on the spot, Dr. Natarajan, but I may ask her to comment because she has been such a wonderful, wonderful asset to the state and to the children, especially in her role with CWS. As a mandated reporter, just to let you know, every effort is made to maintain and protect your confidentiality, but usually as medical providers, it usually comes out because the context of why that referral is being made, they can sometimes figure it out. It's not that they're told. In order for a family to know that it was you that made the report, you have to release your consent. So just know that it is confidential. It is your identity is protected, but sometimes parents can figure it out just based on the nature of why the CWS is being involved. And then lastly, I wanted to just remind you all that when you make a good faith report to CWS, you are immune from civil or criminal liability. So I've been threatened to be sued, that they're going to sue me. I cannot tell you how many times. No, it's probably only been a handful of times, but you know, parents and families sometimes are very upset. And so that may come out, but just to have you reassured, you are immune from any civil or criminal liability if you were doing your job and reporting in good faith. So let's move on to number 3. Only a suspicion for abuse or neglect is needed to make a referral. And so I've pointed out the statute, HRS 350, to show you that our threshold is just a belief, a suspicion. You don't have to prove it. You don't have to go out and try to get additional information. If, let's say, you were concerned that there's a medical condition and you had a condition that's on your differential, is it fine to begin that workup? Absolutely. If it's a test that requires some duration of time before you get it, it's more than a day, or you have any safety concerns, you need to immediately report. And you can still say, I'm waiting for additional tests because I have another condition that I need to rule out. But our concern and our threshold is the safety of that child and just having suspicion. So if you have reason to believe that child abuse or neglect has occurred, or there's a substantial risk that child abuse or neglect may occur in the reasonably foreseeable future, you have to immediately report that to the Department of CWS. Now, it also does read to the police department, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. Usually I tell medical providers to just go ahead and report to CWS because, especially here in our state, they will cross-report to law enforcement. So sometimes I've talked to physicians and nurse practitioners, PAs, and other health professionals, and they have this concern about calling the police and police showing up at their office. Here, it's best to call CWS, and then they can they will cross-report it to law enforcement. Your threshold is harm. And so there's actual harm that I talked about, which is the injury and the list that I showed you a few slides back, the risk of harm, and then imminent harm. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And it is an immediate report. This is the threshold for CWS to intervene. So I've had many conversations with colleagues about, well, CWS didn't take the case. Or I had a case before and I really was concerned. I called it in and CWS didn't take the case. It's not that they don't want to, but they have a threshold, a legal threshold that meets the criteria for them to intervene. Now, intervene in terms of screening the case in, does that mean that they might not offer an alternative response? Yes, that's also a possibility, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But here are the 4 criteria. It must be a child. And here in our state, it must be a child that was born alive. So we don't have anything in our statutes that talk about fetus or unborn children. But if they've been born alive and they are under the age of 18, that is a child. One very important thing to remember is that the maltreater, the offender, has to be the child's parent or their caregiver. And that's where we get a lot of gray in a lot of the cases. But here in Hawaii, for the statute, it must be the child's parent or caregiver. Does that mean that they don't cross-report and refer a case onto law enforcement if it's someone who lives in the home and continues to be a safety risk for that child? Absolutely, CWS will do that. But it may not mean that they will be the investigative agency. The report of harm must be imminent or substantial. Another gray zone, and here's where I tell many colleagues, have a low threshold. We can't do what CWS needs to do. And so your threshold needs to be as low as possible, that if you have that suspicion or belief, you need to make the report. And then that report of harm does have to meet the statute or the definition. And so our CWS colleagues will move forward based on these 4 criteria. So looking back at the statistics again, threatened harm was the overwhelming majority of the 6,700 cases that were reported in 2020. 4535 of those reports were due to threatened harm. When you look at the confirmed cases, again, overwhelming majority were threatened harm. So these kids didn't actually have any injuries. So threat of harm or risk of harm, our families may still be eligible for other services. So they may not get an actual full investigation where they're removed or things of that nature. They may actually get other services that help to, again, strengthen that family. So if it's a family based on the CWS assessment, if it's a family that's lower risk, they may get FSS or family strengthening services. If it's a family that's based on that has more moderate risk, they may get VCM or voluntary case management. And so these are services that are provided through our community partners that provide a variety of services to the family, such as parenting skills. They may offer substance use counseling. They may assist with childcare, a variety of things, again, to keep that child safe in the home and hopefully protect that child from any other concern. So we've talked about the when to report. How do you actually make that report? What does that process look like? So if you are concerned about immediate safety or immediate medical concerns, that is a 911 call. That is not waiting for, to go through the hotline and make that call. That is 911 for them to address any immediate safety concerns or medical concerns if you need medic or ambulance to report. Outside of that, there are several phone numbers that you can use. So here on Oahu, there's an 808 number and a toll-free number to report. How the process works is you leave a message, someone will call you back in a timely fashion. And I've heard that the response time has gotten a lot better. There's a separate number for neighbor islands, and there's a separate number for concerns with child trafficking. And you will have this information, I believe the slides or power will be provided to you. So I wanted to take a moment and just talk about something that was new for me when I moved here, this mandated reporter checklist. And I'm going to go over what's recommended by CWS, and I understand their recommendations. And so I'm going to give you the right process so that you know you will hopefully do the process the way that it's recommended and have positive outcomes when you call and make CWS reports. So this mandated reporter checklist, and that's the website to have access to it, needs to be completed anytime you're going to call in a referral or a report to CWS. And what's recommended is that you actually report it before you make the call. And the reason they really encourage that, and I'm going to tell you very honestly, I don't think that this happens all the time, but their belief is that when you fill this out completely before, that you will be able to effectively communicate what your concern is with that child, and they will have all the information that they need. So it's a 4-page document. The first 2 pages are the demographics. They need to know where that child lives or where that child goes to school, because one of the reasons that CWS is sometimes unsuccessful when a call is made is that they are unable to locate a child or a family. And so they are going to ask some demographic information. So whether you know where the child goes to school, or hopefully you have their address, those are things that are going to be very essential on those first 2 pages. So name, age, date of birth, gender, who lives in the home, that's also very important, the address, who you think maltreater might be, and you do not need to know that. If you do know, if it's reported that, I use Uncle Johnny, so I hope that no one has an Uncle Johnny. I'm sure that they're a very lovely person, but Uncle Johnny tends to be who I use as an offender. But if you happen to know that Uncle Johnny is the offender, then they would want you to provide that information. And then they really want you to describe the harm, and then any other pertinent information you might have, medical records, labs, if you have pictures, etc. So pages 1 and 2, demographics, household composition, those sorts of things. I did want to include pages 3 and 4, just so that you can actually see what they have. So section A, you see, is the actual harm. And I've mentioned HRS 350 as one of the statutes. There's another really important statute, HRS 587. It's the Child Protective Act. It's 62 pages, 62 pages. And what it does is it goes in great detail about injuries, investigations, child protection, everything that you might have a question about. So if you're feeling extra inspired by this presentation, go check out HRS 587. But for the purposes of the mandated reporter checklist, you have factors that are included in sections A, B, C, and D. So for section A, it's actual harm. And so they'll ask you to check the areas of harm, whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological harm, neglect, or intentional drugging. You can actually check no actual harm. So those would be the cases where you have a concern and there's a threat of harm or a risk of harm. And then they have the safety section. And you'll see that there are 4 criteria. That's A, B, C, and D. And so you're going to go through those 15 factors and you're going to put a letter that corresponds to that specific safety factor. Or you're going to put no safety concerns and check that bottom area. Then on the last page, we have section C, which is the risk. And they take into consideration the child, is this a child who is developmentally delayed? And so they may be more vulnerable because of that delay. What's the baseline of harm? Is it something that is a one-time or is it chronic? The caregiver characteristics, this is a family where you've been helping them manage through, substance abuse, things of that nature, and then other factors that involve the family, such as intimate partner violence. Are there any stresses for the family? Now we're starting to really use our social determinants of health and using that information to really, again, look at risk and help to get our families engaged before we get to levels where we have to call CWS. And then the last section, you may not have any of this information, but if you do, they would like you to include that in the form. And that's just if they have a prior history with CWS. Have they been receiving public health nursing, therapy for the family? Are there concerns about educational assistance? All of those things. And then that little box at the bottom is for you to put any additional information. And you can use a separate page to add if that's necessary as well. So I get asked this question a lot about HIPAA and reporting. So one of the things with HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is that you are allowed to disclose protected health information as it relates to concerns for child abuse and neglect. And that is to child welfare services. So any treatment, medical intervention, sharing of information for the purpose of that investigation with CWS is allowed. You do not have to get parents to sign. You don't have to get the legal guardian's authority or to sign a release when it involves an investigation, an active investigation with CWS. That's a little different when it comes to the police. The police do have to get a release. Now, Dr. Natarajan may want to chime in on that at the end because I've seen a couple of different things happen, but that is the proper thing and I'm trying to teach you the right way. Okay, so when you're picking up that phone and you're calling and you're making this report, you're going to say who you are, what you do, your agency, and you're going to provide any relevant history. And you're going to have that checklist right nearby so that the questions that they ask you, you have all that information handy. You're going to provide enough information to locate that child, whether it's their address or their school. And then you're going to fax that completed report list, checklist to one of those 2 numbers. You can also mail it, but I just put the fax number on there. The address to mail it is on the form as well. So number 4, how are we doing on time? Great. Number 4. CWS is civil versus criminal. Again, how I created this top 5 list was based on a number of questions that I have received, not just here in Hawaii, but throughout, the years of doing this work. CWS, when you hear child welfare services, and it's also called CPS in many other states, or child protective services, take a moment, what is the first thing that comes into your mind? You hear CWS, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? So many of you may not have this as the first thing, but I will tell you over the years and talking to a lot of people, the first thing is CWS is going to come in and take children. They are baby snatchers, they are keiki snatchers, they just come in and they take children. And that is not their responsibility. If you remember the first point is that their job is to protect children. They don't just automatically come in. If it's a safety concern, they will, because their job is to protect children, but ultimately they want families to be successful. And I think that we do a good job here in the state in trying to make sure that families are successful. CWS also does not determine if a crime has occurred. CWS, their job is to determine if harm has occurred. The job of determining if a crime has occurred is left to our fantastic, wonderful colleagues in HPD. So law enforcement determines if a crime has occurred. If a crime has occurred and we are concerned, or CWS is concerned about that safety of the child and due to imminent harm, then the police can take protective custody, what we call PC. Only the police can do that. So that is an action that's done not by a detective, it's actually just done by a local police officer. And here's where I think we have another really important job, and that is to educate law enforcement when we interact with them. A lot of times these are police officers who are doing their best to make the right decision, but have a big responsibility, which is to take custody of a child. And so it is really important for us to make sure that we are communicating our concern for harm and risk of harm for this child in order for them to effectively do their job. So once police are involved, they take immediate custody. They then immediately transfer that protective custody to CWS or to the department. And CWS then will assume temporary foster custody of that child. So those are the steps that need to happen. CWS gets a call, there's concern for immediate harm or risk of harm. So for example, a situation that we might have in a hospital is we are concerned that a parent may flee, and we have concerns that this child is being abused and this parent is going to abscond. We want to immediately call CWS because that gets the process going, and then law enforcement will get involved. And if you feel, if there's a safety concern and it's immediate, the police can be called right away. And then CWS with the police will make sure that that immediate removal will then happen. And then they transfer that custody over to the department or CWS. So we've talked about the role and responsibilities of CWS, our roles as mandated reporters, when to report, how to report, the mandated checklist, and what that process looks like when a case gets screened in. So when that call happens, there are things that you can expect from child welfare services. Once that threshold is met, they do an assessment, they begin to investigate. There are a couple of responses that can happen. And so I've touched on a few of them earlier in the presentation, but just to kind of give you another way to look at it. So sometimes there are reports that are made not in good faith. As medical providers, we will hopefully be making reports in good faith, but since anyone can report, I've had instances where begrudged neighbors call in and make things up to get a family investigated. So in those instances, we will have what they will call it in the state is unsubstantiated. So for example, a family gets a call, CWS gets involved because they said that there's no electricity, running water, poor living conditions, no food in the home. CWS gets the call, screens it in, and they go out and do an assessment and find that all those things are false. So that would be unsubstantiated. So it wouldn't be not confirmed because it wasn't a valid report that was being made. Also on the list of differential responses, no action by the department. I've talked briefly about the family strengthening services in VCM. And these are just good reminders that even if a case doesn't meet the threshold of child abuse and neglect, there are still ways that we can help our families. And these are some of the ways that we can by CWS getting involved and linking our families through these services. Now, you'll see with VCM, the first word is voluntary. So that means that the family has to want to engage in those services. And then if they do an investigation, those are the three outcomes. It will either be confirmed that there was child maltreatment, not confirmed, doesn't mean it didn't occur, they just didn't have enough to meet that criteria, and then unsubstantiated, the example I gave of bad faith reports that are being made. So the last number on my top 5 is number 5. And this again, based on questions that I get, and important for you to know, to tell or not to tell. If you have a concern and you are a mandated reporter and you've made the decision that I'm going to make a report to CWS, should you tell the family? Now, I will tell you in all the years of doing this that disclosing to the family really can preserve your relationship. If you explain to them that you have this concern, it's not pointing a finger necessarily, even though that parent who may be in your office is the non-offending parent. Ultimately, if we are putting that keiki first and we are saying that we want to make sure your child is safe and healthy, and part of doing that is I can't be in your home, I can't be the eyes and ears out in the community. I am required by law to inform child welfare services. And if you say it and come up with some standard language and say the same thing every time, I will tell you, most times, the overwhelming majority of times, you are going to be able to preserve that relationship and keep a child safe. There are going to be instances where the family is mad, they're disgruntled, I'm taking my child to another practice, you're horrible, horrible doctor, provider. Yes, there are going to be those times. If you are concerned for your safety, that would be another time that I would say, be very mindful, and maybe you don't want to, but the overwhelming circumstances I'm going to recommend, because it's a horrible feeling for a family to leave your office and to have CWS show up at their house and you didn't have that conversation and express that concern. Again, if you're unsafe, you're not sure, I would not recommend that you do that. But if you come up with standard language and how you tell families about making sure that that child is safe, that child is healthy, and that you are required by law, it's the language that I use all the time. And I'm a child abuse pediatrician, and 9 times out of 10, probably 9.5 times out of 10, everything goes really well. So other things to expect from CWS. We've touched on some of this, but I wanted to go over a couple of other points because, again, these are things that have popped up when people call me. Confidentiality, we've touched on. You are expected to have some confidentiality. Your consent is required to release it. Now, where that becomes a little different is when the case is in court before a judge. It could be court ordered for the offender or the claimant towards the offender to be reported. So I do want to make sure that you know that. You can expect an investigations, service intervention, some sort of assessment, cross-reporting to law enforcement in the instances where we need to make a determination of the crime or it rises to the level of the crime, such as abusive head trauma, significant injuries, such as fractures, those things. Urgency of a response. Usually when it's a medical provider, we are looking for immediate, within 4-hour response. There's a subset within CWS called CRT, or Crisis Response Team. That team really should be reporting out for medical injuries and concerns. So that should be our level, is that they are usually going to respond urgently when there's injury. If there's threat or risk of harm, that could be a couple of days, business days. You can expect to know the disposition of your referral. So if you make a call, you can be told what the outcome of that referral is. And if there was an investigation, you can be told what the disposition of that investigation is. Now, I will tell you, they're not going to go through details of the case. They're not going to give you those specifics, but they can provide that information to you. It's not a written assessment. You're not going to get a letter in the mail, but you are entitled to have that information. And if you are the medical home and primary care provider for that child, it's really important that you have that information. One of the things that I have learned since I've been here is that CWS can also do consultations, which I thought was really interesting. So let's just say, you're really not sure, you are trying to meet that threshold and you think you're there, but you really want to be sure, because I may be talking about calling, but it is a stressful situation for families for CWS to be called. But again, if you're calling in good faith, it is the right thing to do. But it is a stressful situation. And so sometimes you might be unsure. And if you're unsure, there are a couple of things that you can do. And one of them is you can call in and get a consultation. And so with the consultation and why that's important, and I wrote a note down because I wanted to make sure that I told you exactly what my CWS colleague, I reached out to a CWS colleague and I said, I'm going to have the attention of several medical providers, and I'm presenting on CWS referrals. What is it that you want me to share with them? And so what she told me was, CWS considers medical providers and mandated reporters to be their eyes and their ears in the community. Just as they are the eyes and ears for us, they can go out to the home and provide valuable information for me when I'm doing consultations. It is the same expectation that they have of us. So that if you are not sure, sometimes just that call that you make might be helpful in CWS identifying and locating a family. Maybe it was a family that they were looking for, and now you've made this call and they now know where this family is. Sometimes it's a family that has a prior CWS involvement. You may not have any idea, but they may have had 10 prior referrals, and now this has raised the risk level for that family. And that's not an exact number to say that that's the number that they have to reach. You may not know, but there's already an open case. There's an active CWS case, and now you're calling in with a concern. This is all very, very valuable information. And so if you're not sure, you do have an option to make a consultation, but I really encourage you to make that call and to make calls for actual referrals. But if you are hesitant in any way, you do have this option to discuss it with CWS. And I would definitely encourage Dr. Natarajan to chime in at the end if she has other thoughts about that. We talked about this, what you can expect from CWS. There's no written feedback, and they don't give you any personal or confidential case information, only the disposition or the service provision, whether that's been completed, so if that's parenting classes, or if the service provision is in progress. I wanted to close by saying there's a lot of gray in these cases. No one case is alike, no two cases are alike. So if you have questions, KCAP is here, Dr. Natarajan and myself, we are here to help you think through these cases. We provide consultation for the infants and children who are admitted into the hospital, but I recently did start a KCAP clinic. It's an outpatient medical clinic where I can see patients. Right now, it's only one day a week, but for second opinions, this does not mean that you don't call CWS. This might be an instance where a good example is you have a child in your office, they are safe, you believe that they're safe in a safe home, and you think that the medical, what you're seeing on exam might be something that's not abusive. You pick up the phone, you call us, we have a discussion. If you have pictures, that's even great. And then I can see that patient in my office and formally help assess what that is. Again, these are kids where you don't have safety concerns. This not emergency, like they have injuries that require emergency intervention. Those kids need to go to the ED, but there are instances where it could be helpful to see some of those kids. And then I also see kids who have been seen in the ED, are safe. Maybe they were placed in foster care from the ED that I can also see in clinic as a follow-up. We partner with our social work team, and I'm happy to announce that we now have a dedicated social worker for our team. And so she is going to be such an asset for us as she liaises with you all or with CWS or with law enforcement. We're here for you. We're a medical resource to not only you as our medical colleagues, but to child welfare services, law enforcement, legal colleagues. We're here to provide education, court testimony, whether that's as fact witnesses or as expert witnesses. And I'm going to use that moment to just sort of say, that's another question. It didn't make it to my top 5 list, but I often get asked about going to court. And I will be surprised if I look at the chat and there's not a question about going to court. Yes, if you call and you make a referral, is there a possibility you could go to court? There is a possibility that you could go to either family court or to criminal court, depending on what it is that you've reported. And that could be Maybe you were the first person that learned of this abuse and a child actually made statements to you that you did a fantastic job in documenting verbatim with quotation marks in your medical record. You were then the only person that really, or the best person to really share that information with the court. And so if you ever get subpoenaed, here's the two things I tell medical providers who aren't used to going to court. If you get a subpoena, the first thing I want you to do is breathe, take a deep breath. And then the second thing I want you to do is call me. Call me, call Dr. Natarajan, reach out to us. We go to court so often and we are here to help you. There's no reason for this to be a super stressful process for you. So definitely call us. Here are the numbers. If it's a medical concern and it's urgent or emergent, please reach us through the operator. That's the number. You're going to ask for the KCAP physician on call. And then if you just need to, it's not urgent, but you have a question and you want to discuss a case, not urgently, you can call my office number, leave a message. It rings right to my phone and I am able to call you back. And in summary, these are the top 5 things I want you to remember and that you need to know. What the goal of CWS is to protect children. That's all of our jobs, to protect children and make sure they're safe. And just that last gentle reminder that you are a mandated reporter, but your threshold is really low. It's a suspicion, a belief, or a reason to believe that a child has either been harmed or that they're in some foreseeable risk of harm. I apologize, I did not mention imminent harm. Imminent harm is harm that you think will occur within 90 days. That's 3 months. So that's pretty wide. So again, that's just letting you know the bar is low because we want to keep children safe. CWS doesn't come in and just take their children. Their job is to see if harm has occurred. That's a civil responsibility. And if you have to make that call, it's really important, I think, to have communication, a standard language that you use with all families when you have to make that call. That goes a long way in preserving that relationship, all the while keeping children safe. And so I thank you for your attention. We have time for questions. I'll go to the chat. One last thing, next month is Child Abuse Prevention and Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We're asking for on April 7th, if you can wear royal blue as you stand in solidarity and with our community for specifically for that month. And I was told by Summer to leave this up as a reminder I'll let you say what you need to say. And then I'm going to ask if it's okay if Dr. Natarajan, I don't know if she's still on, but if she can unmute herself and just share anything that she might want to clarify. And Summer, I'll let you do your piece first. And then if we can give Dr. Natarajan just a moment. Sorry to put you on the spot, Dr. Natarajan, but I'm sure there's something you might want to add.
I have started the post-session questions, and in the meantime, Dr. Luker can go over the questions. There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Yes, perfect. So the first question came fairly early, and my apologies, Dr. Begay, that I didn't forward it on sooner, but his question was, are there any, if you have any idea how statistics have been changing over the years and whether COVID had an impact?
Yeah, that is a great question. So these are the latest statistics that they have, and I'm like chomping at the bit for something more recent, but I can tell you nationally, there was a dip initially. And that was just because there was lower access to mandated reporters. So kids weren't going to school. And so we did see that dip in that first, from March to June-ish, July. Then that last quarter, we saw an uptick. And this is again, nationally. 2021 numbers were pretty similar. I will tell you anecdotally for me, the severity of cases were worse. So we saw kids with really bad injuries, kids that had, really, really bad injuries. So I would say, although the numbers statistically might have remained close from like the 5-year trend, with the exception of 2020, because decreased referrals due to decreased access to kids and mandated reporters, the severity was pretty bad.
Thank you for answering that. So just a few more questions. If the maltreater is suspected to be a healthcare provider or a CWS worker, who should be contacted? That's a great question.
That's a great question, man. That's a great question. So you still call CWS because they will cross-report it to the police. Now, their statute is parent or caregiver, but they still have the job of protecting children. And so they will, of course, report it to the police. Or you can just call the police. Now, I know that for a lot of medical providers, that's really uncomfortable. So, but those are your options. You call the police or you call CWS, they'll screen it out and cross-report to law enforcement. Great question, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question was, will CWS show up at the clinic?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so maybe I'll change my topic to top 10 things and address some of these things. These are awesome. So if it's immediate and there's a safety concern, like that child should not be going home with that parent, they can and they should. Alternatively, that child can go to the emergency department for further, like if it's an injury that needs assessment, that child would go to the emergency department and they would report there. Now, from your office, if there's a safety concern and you think that they're with the potential maltreater, then you should not really be sending them because that's a safety concern. So safety concerns, do not pass go, wait for someone to respond or be advised of how they will respond, whether that's to your clinic or sending them via EMS to the emergency department and having CWS respond there. I've seen both of those things happen in the state. Great question. These are good. Well, I have a list of the I can get a copy of these questions from the chat, right? Because I'd love to see how I can incorporate this in a future presentation, Dr. Luca or Summer.
I'll make sure to copy them out of the chat before we end.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
What's next?
And then the last question was, if no two cases are alike, then each case with a family or many previously reported cases is considered what? So I feel like a game show host.
Yeah, you know, it really depends because we're not privy to that sensitive information. And I always find it very interesting. Here in the state, they do not share information. I came from where I first started doing this work was in New Jersey, and DYFS, Division of Youth and Family Services, they shared information. I feel like if we're sharing very private, confidential medical information, that sometimes that, for me as a child abuse pediatrician, is part of what I add to my assessment. So, but we don't do that here. That information is all confidential. So we don't know what those prior referrals were for. Those prior referrals could have been for things that were all unsubstantiated. Remember, that's bad faith calls, or they could have been all for instances where they were either not confirmed, meaning there was a concern for abuse and neglect, they just couldn't, prove it, or they could have all been for cases that were confirmed. So because we don't know that, we are not privy to that information, we allow CWS to have our concern, and I don't think that they use an algorithm, or I'm not really sure how they make that determination. More to come. As I said, I'm still learning, and then they use that information to determine whether or not, if it's just a call for risk, is it a lower risk or is it a more moderate risk based on the call. And I think I answered the question. Did I answer the question, Dr. Luca?
I think so. I think it's hard.
Okay, whoever asked the question, I don't know. You can reach me separately if I did not answer that to the best of my ability.
From my experience here, each call is logged in, and if it's a new concern, it's logged in as a new issue on the CWS master log. If it's more details about the same issue, they still log it in. So whoever gets to review the case actually sees all of it at Child Welfare Services. One other, safety net we have here in our state is Child Welfare Services is, by their own mandates, required to review cases with an MDT outside of child welfare. And years ago, that MDT was at Kapiolani, but for the past 6 years, it's been at Child and Family Service. But there is a different set of professionals who are knowledgeable about child abuse and child neglect, who review cases for child welfare services. But at the bottom line, Child Welfare Services makes the decisions on what services to force on the parents or what services to voluntarily give to the parents.
Thank you so much, Dr. Natarajan. Yes, really, there's not enough time to kind of hit all of those points, but I'm so glad that you mentioned the MDT process. That is very different than a number of states function, but it's a wonderful function here for our state because we do have the expertise of medical, Dr. Natarajan, mental health, and a nurse and
Social worker.
Social work, separate social worker who reviewed the cases. The one thing with that I would say is that CWS has to refer the case to the MDT, and those with serious harm should automatically be referred for a review. So we just always try to keep on top of those, that process as well. Other questions? I'm sorry,
I was just going to say,
Natarajan.
our MDT actually gets all the intakes. So one of our staff on the MDT reviews all the intakes. And then we reach out and say, hey, this meets your criteria. This needs an MDT.
Yes. Another
But
safety net.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Natarajan. More questions, Dr. Luker?
Thank you, Dr. Natarajan and Dr. Morgan. If you could just review maybe the first 2 questions of the poll session, because everyone got the 3rd and 4th, and the second question is kind of split right down the middle.
Okay. So, yeah, it's always fun making these questions. So one of the roles of child welfare services is to determine if a crime has occurred. So if you remember in one of the slides, I said they are to determine if harm has occurred. The role of a crime occurring is law enforcement. So the response for that is one of the roles of the service determines crime is called. So that's false. The key word there is harm. Sorry if that was tricky. And then the second one, protective custody can only be performed by police. I had a slide on that. Protective custody is actually called police protective custody here in our state, because that's not how every state functions. But police protective custody, it's only performed by a police officer. And then once they, in the cases of imminent harm, immediate safety concerns, will immediately take custody. They don't need the parent's consent or release from the parents. Once the police take custody, they immediately transfer it over to protective custody with, it's called foster care custody. It's not actually called protective custody with CWS. So I think maybe the wording on that, if I put police protective custody, then you would have said true. I wasn't trying to trick you. It's just that to understand that protective custody is a police initiated process here in our state, and that is not the same for every state. Dr. Natarajan, are you still there?
She had to drop off.
Oh, okay, yes, because we have another meeting at 1 o'clock. Is there anything else? Any other pressing questions? I know it's 1:01. Everyone has to go. Anything else?
I think those were all questions. Thank you so much again.
Thank you,
for joining
everyone.
us. Oh my gosh, those were fantastic questions and answers. And I think we all learned a lot and very, very much appreciate you for joining us. We'll have you back in a few weeks and are looking forward to our next session with you.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.
Everyone for
Morgan.
joining.